like to welcome you and thank you for joining us this evening for our second installment in the Spring Term Salon series. This is a series that happened throughout the months of February. Every Thursday we have a salon. It is curated by Associate Dean Sonia Chow. She's the Associate Dean of Research, and this series is meant to promote research, establish new connections, opportunities to energize research at the School of Architecture and also across the university. This year's theme is affordable housing. And now I'm going to let Sonia tell you more about this particular session and our guests tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. So thank you all for joining us this evening, first and foremost. We appreciate your taking time out of your schedule to be with us to have this conversation on a topic that we think is very important to South Florida in particular, because as we all know, the affordability of our housing in this region has gone through the roof, and so we're all struggling to figure out how to ensure that there are no socioeconomic repercussions as we move forward, so that we are including everyone in our vision of a future Miami. And that starts by our thinking about how people have safe and equitable access to housing. So for that purpose, this evening's topic is Beyond the Bottom Line. What are the socioeconomic repercussions of losing affordable housing? And I have asked our director of the Masters of Real Estate and Urban Design program, Dr. Chuck Bowl, to introduce our moderator, and we will take it from there. We are about a half hour of conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And before I go, I just wanted to reiterate that this is a collaboration between the School of Architecture and our co-hosts, which is the U.S. Department of HUD, the Southeast region. We have with us Gloria Shanahan, who has been one of the co-curators for this event, and my colleague, Madeline Lee, who has also been another, very important member of this curatorial team. So with that said, Chuck, are you ready? All right.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out. We're competing against the basketball game tonight, so thank you for choosing us. So I just have the honors of introducing the panel, and then I'll turn it over. So first, I want to welcome Nicole Crooks. Nicole is the Overtown Community Engagement Manager of Catalyst Miami. Welcome. We've got Albert Milo. Al is president of Related Urban Development Group. Al's been a great partner with us, so doing some student projects as well and taking good care of our graduates and alumni as well as that. Welcome, Al. Robin Backen came from just across campus, director of the Office of Civic and Community Engagement. We've also done a lot of work together over the years. They do a lot on affordable housing. And she's also Senior Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education and the Charlton W. Tebow Associate Professor of History at the University of Miami. So welcome, Robin. And then it's my pleasure to turn this over to Hannah Eskra. Hannah has also done a lot with us over the years with our students and come into the classroom. When we were kind of brainstorming who would be a good person to moderate and lead the discussion, Hannah's perfect because she's got both public and private sector experience. She's currently president of Murray Development Partners and vice president of real estate development at the Preservation of Affordable Housing. Welcome, Hannah.
Welcome, everybody. Whoa. Hope everyone's doing well. We're going to start this discussion off by defining what is affordable housing, and not affordable means you spend 30% of your rent or 30% of your income for rent or mortgage, right? What does affordable housing look like in our community, and what are the ways we're losing affordable housing right now? Al, you want to
Thank you, Hannah, and the university for inviting me to have an opportunity to talk about a topic that is certainly near and dear to my heart. But affordable housing a lot of times is misunderstood, and there's different types of affordable housing. There's subsidized housing. There's traditional affordable housing. You're hearing a lot of talk now about workforce housing and some of the challenges of middle income folks being able to afford housing. But it's as Hannah described, it's housing that's affordable to you at your income level. And depending on what that income level is, and as long as it's not more than 30% of what you earn, then it's deemed to be affordable.
In what are ways we're losing affordable housing right now? I can think of some examples, like we built subsidized housing in the mid-90s, but the state only put 30-year land use restrictions on them, right? So we're at that 30-year period, that housing is going out of the affordable housing inventory. Think of anything else? Any other examples of what we're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, you have the tax credit program, and when those EUAs expired, you're correct, you can convert those units to traditional housing, but you also have a lot of old Section 8 contracts that are expiring, and those are really, really challenging when those convert and move to regular housing, because in many instances that is housing of last resort for those families, and they're able to pay 30% of their income also, but most of them, or a lot of them, are at the ELI level. So when those units are lost, those are almost impossible to replace, right? For instance, as a regular new funded deal, typically you get 5%. Sometimes you get 10% of the units, but it's typically 5% that is set aside for those ELI households. So every time you lose a Section 8 contract, that has a big ripple effect on the loss of housing, and a really, really tough impact for those families that reside in those projects.
We need to move on, but I do want to just ask you, Nicole, what are you seeing in Overtown?
In terms of the housing?
Losing the housing, yeah.
Well, a big issue is the gentrification, something that we call climate gentrification, which is directly related to the impacts of climate change. And in terms of Overtown, it was a location that was once redlined, as with a lot of historically Black communities. And so these were the communities that no one wanted to live in, right? And now that we're facing climate change, these are the places that people are trying to escape to because we're higher, drier land, right? Okay. All right. No, I'm trying to see the directions. I'm like, okay. So what we're finding is that there's no way for people to be able to afford rents. Like, we have single parents who are living in homes in horrendous conditions and trying to pay $1,500 for a 2-bedroom that's really coming apart, having to work 3 and 4 jobs just to try to make ends meet, not able to. And so we see families overwhelmingly being pushed into being unhoused and sleeping in their cars, under bridges, just because there's no place to go. And the rents keep going up because there's all this development that's going on around us, but it's not for us, right? And so that's creating a pandemic, really, in terms of housing.
Yeah. So Miami-Dade County lost 25,000 people last year. We actually lost population, and we lost it primarily because people can't afford their housing. So, Robin, why is access to affordable housing so important to helping preserve these communities of color and also making our housing affordable for our workforce?
Yeah, so, we all heard about during the pandemic how many people from higher cost metropolitan regions like New York, Chicago, San Francisco were moving to Miami, right? Lower taxes, lower relative housing costs, a sort of entrepreneurial, deregulatory environment. So while the state of Florida saw about a 3% population increase, Miami-Dade, as Hannah mentioned, saw a 1% decrease in population. And it's precisely the people that Nicole is talking about who are leaving Miami-Dade County because they can no longer afford it. So they're moving to other places outside of the county, to Central Florida. They're moving out of the state. And increasingly, it's not just, Albert was talking about extremely low income families, but we're also talking about middle class families, right? We're talking about the frontline workers that we celebrated during the pandemic, right? Our teachers, our police officers, our doctors, our nurses often can't afford to live here. And so what we're seeing is that there's an influx of population at a relatively higher wealth level. The people who are being forced out are people who are lower income. And I just want to give you some statistics because I think it's kind of shocking. I mean, we all know about the affordability crisis, but when you hear the numbers, it's really striking. So Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies labeled Miami-Dade County the least affordable housing market in the country in 2022, right? And that's when Mayor Levine Cava declared a housing crisis in Dade County. So 62% of our renters in Miami-Dade County are cost burdened, 62%, right? And when we look at the way housing prices have gone up in home ownership, the cost of owning a home between 2019 and 2023 went up 60%, 60%. The cost of renting went up 55%. So if you're already a homeowner, it's good for you, right? That home ownership costs are going up, your property is worth more money. If you're a renter, you have no control over what you're paying each month for your housing, right? So that really creates a precarious situation for many of our lower income families, but really for all families. But as Nicole mentioned, it's particularly difficult for those communities that have faced a history of displacement, right? 100-year history of displacement. So we look at Overtown, historically thriving Black community that built Miami, that built the railroad that made Miami possible. So we saw early on, in the early part of the 20th century, the expansion of the Central Business District, really pushing Black families further and further out, right? We saw when some of the first public housing was built, that Black families were pushed even further northwest. The construction of the highway tore through Overtown. Now there's climate gentrification pressures. And so what we see is it's not just that people can't afford housing. That's tragic, and that has an impact on our overall well-being for our community. If the people who work here can't live here, how are we going to have a workforce? How are we going to survive? But it also means that those kind of historic components, the historic fabric of neighborhoods are getting destroyed and continually being destroyed. So that has an impact on a community's ability to thrive, right? A community's ability to support itself, to support one another. So there are a whole host of dimensions beyond just the cost of housing that impact the well-being of our local communities.
So Nicole, how do developers ensure that they receive good community input when they're to meet the needs of the community, when they're doing a development in the community? And what are the implications when it's not done effectively?
I think we have demonstrations of what happens when it's not done effectively all around us, right? And this is when people feel silenced. Community members feel silenced. They don't feel as though their voices matter. They're not centered in the decision making. A lot of times what happens is after decisions have been made, there are charrettes or there are meetings that are held that say that they're community engagement, but they're not actually community engagement because decisions have already been made. So really centering community from the very beginning in terms of figuring out what the community needs. Community members know what we need, right? The mere fact that we have survived in some of the roughest situations is indicative of the fact that we know what we need, but the resources are given to other people, right? And decisions are made by people who don't look like us and do not have our experiences. Far too often, I'm in rooms that look, I mean, this is very diverse in comparison to a lot of the rooms that I'm in, to be honest with you, in terms of the people who make the decisions about my community, which is a historically Black community. And so people are out of touch. And so when we think about even preserving the fabric of our culture and our legacy, asking people, what do you need? What do you want? What do you require? And allowing organizations that have the tendency of centering community voice and walking with communities through situations and being able to hear, and people that communities trust, to really be able to lead that charge, because often our community members don't trust the people who are coming into our communities for good reason. Because we have been abused so many times. We talk about I-95 coming through, but right now, even in Overtown, we are facing yet another version of the displacement from the highway, because we have a double-decker highway coming through right now. And so really being able to say, what do you need, right? And not creating an environment for the people who are to come, but really honoring the people who historically have been there and are currently there.
So Robin, what's the impact on employment in the workforce when employees don't have access to affordable housing? I mean, we're seeing that everywhere right now.
Right, I know that Mr. Milo, when we were chatting the other day, was talking about a new project that they just built right up the road from UM, and that a lot of the applicants for those affordable units are coming from UM employees, right? I mean, a lot of major institutions, University of Miami is a major employer here in South Florida, one of the leading employers in South Florida. We have trouble hiring people because they can't afford, it's not just they can't afford to live in Coral Gables, right? They can't afford to live in the county. And even if they can afford to live in the county, it means that they either need to have a car because they have to drive far, right? So that has implications in terms of adding transportation costs, and also environmental costs. So we know that if the University of Miami is having trouble hiring staff because they can't afford to live here, what happens to the majority of our employers who are small-scale entrepreneurs looking to hire workers? How are their workers going to afford to live here? How are our teachers going to afford it? How are our nurses going to afford it, right? What is it that we're going to do? How are we going to be a thriving community? We are a location whose #1 industry is hospitality and tourism. Right? We need people to work in hotels, in restaurants. So those people are the people that we're talking about, right? That even if they're working 3 jobs, still can't afford an apartment. The average rent in Miami-Dade County right now is over $2,000, right? Over $2,000. That's just extraordinary. And so it really means that not only aren't we going to be able to hire the employees that we need to build a thriving economy, but that we are basically not going to have the workforce that can take us into, a new period of prosperity. If we want to talk about, branching out and the tech industry and the role of the tech industry, it's great, but we need to be able to have housing that's affordable to every sector, to every group. We talk a lot about workforce housing now, but people at extremely low incomes are the people who are suffering the most, who have the least access to housing, who have the longest waiting list to try to get any housing. So these are really crucial issues that we need to deal with if we want to talk about the future of Miami from an economic perspective, let alone, from a climate perspective.
And just because Albert and I deal in math problems, that's literally what we do all day, is trying to get our housing, to build it, to afford it. But in homeownership, the rule of thumb is 2.5 times your income. So if we've got a median house price, I think at around $500,000 right now, you need to have a household income of about $175,000. Our median household income in this county is about $77,000, $75,000, something like that. I mean, there's a real disparity in what we can afford and what the prices are out there. So Albert, do you want to talk about the economics of affordable housing? Why is it so difficult for us to finance this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, the best analogy I can give is that there's, construction costs don't discriminate. So that's just in a very simplistic way to explain it, right? It costs a certain amount of money to build the housing, and whether there are differences in higher end products, it's usually in the finishes. But what it takes to build the project is, to a certain extent, not in our direct control, right? We're subject to, supply chain issues. We're subject to, material price increases, all of those issues that affect, cost. Right now, we're also dealing with high insurance costs for projects, right? That's an industry-wide problem. Currently, interest rates are higher, so all of those things affect what it takes to build one of these projects. And our approach has been a little bit different in the fact that in order to deal with the math, that Hannah is mentioning is correct, is how do we address some of those households from a mixed income perspective, right? That's really been our approach. We've implemented it now in several projects, and we have projects that are, have a percentage of units that are market rate housing, all the way down to a percentage of units that are subsidized housing, and some of those are elderly subsidized housing, right? Because ELI households that are a tremendous disadvantage. Well, elderly residents are at an even further of a disadvantage, because they're totally dependent on that Social Security check. So, I mean, efficiencies are more than $1,000 anywhere in Miami-Dade County. Forget about, 2 bedrooms like Nicole's mentioning. Just any converted garage anywhere, if you can find it, would be that, which is unheard of. So, as and as Dr. Bakken mentioned, the topic used to be about lower income families had a challenge finding housing, right? Well, the pendulum has swung to where now middle income families and young professionals and a lot of other professions are having trouble finding housing. And recently I got called about an elderly couple, and it dawned on me that some of the issues, going back to efficiencies, there's a lot of places in Miami-Dade County that people would convert their garage and create housing. It used to be it would help the homeowner get a little bit of income, but it also would help somebody that was of lower income get at least a place to live. Well, now as the middle income people are having some struggles finding housing, what used to maybe cost $500-$600 now is $1,000-$1,200. They can't afford that. Some of the elderly people are getting put out, and now they're becoming homeless, because one of the issues and the topic was what happens, what are the socio-economic repercussions when we lose affordable housing? They're real. They're real. The ability to not have a roof over your head creates a lot of different challenges that then create additional pressures on the safety net system, within our county. So it's not just that rents are increasing. I mean, that is a fact. That's a mathematical fact. But the underlying issue is what effect that has on communities, as Nicole mentioned, when somebody has to go live in their car. Like, what is the ripple effect of all of that? So the math, in our approach is, you got to have a true mixed income development where we have some market rate units, we have some workforce units, We have some affordable units, and in many instances, we have subsidized units, and we have them all living together. They're all sharing the same building, sharing the same amenities. And it allows us to use some of those higher paying units to help subsidize some of those lower paying units and make that math work.
Questions? Are you? Sorry, okay. All right, so I think, anybody want to add?
Yeah,
anything?
I want to take a moment to really pause also, because we talk about a lot about the units and the spaces and building up and the density and all of these things. But one of the things that crosses my mind a lot is, when is enough enough, right? When we talk about in other communities, like in New York, in terms of rent control, that's an issue, right? We don't have that here. This place is not friendly for renters, and it's been very difficult to be a homeowner here for a number of reasons. And so when we talk about the predatory capitalism, I think we lose sight. We look at the numbers, right? We look at so many things, but we forget about the people, right? We forget about the people. And the people, when we think about, especially the Black people who were the pioneers of this community. Last night they had the most beautiful tribute at the Heat game. I don't know if anyone saw it, but I asked that you would go and you would take a look and that you would see it. But when you think about the sacrifices that were made by the first Black people that came here, so many sacrifices. When we think about the indigenous people, and even now we have construction going on over sacred burial grounds, right? Because we want more stuff and we want more things and we want to pile more and more people into a small amount of space. And we never say that's enough. That's enough. That's why it takes over an hour to get from Overtown to Coral Gables, because it's never enough. There's not enough. And we don't give honor to those who came before us. So when we start talking about the housing, and when we start talking about what does it look like, I was speaking with an elder one time, and it blew my mind. We were walking, and she said that basically what we are, especially in the historically Black communities here in Overtown, in Miami, is that we're pawns in a monopoly game that we have not agreed to participate in, right? And then the irony is that years later, well, soon after she said that, I started seeing all of these portrayals of monopoly throughout what I call North Overtown. Y'all may call it Wynwood, but for me, it's North Overtown, because it was Overtown. It will always be Overtown to me. And so you started seeing all of these portrayals of monopoly. And it's because we're losing sight of the people, or we are dehumanizing the people to make it acceptable to do what we are doing for predatory capitalism, right? And then it's this ongoing cycle that never ends because it's never enough. And the people who have the least amount to fight are the people who have the most to lose. And so I just want to bring your attention. One day I was over on the corner of 8th and 2nd, and this sign was there. This is in Overtown. This is in my community that's surrounded by all kind of construction that is being decimated by all of these buildings that we can't afford to live in. People are being pushed out, and it's a monopoly game. It's a monopoly game for the developers and oftentimes for the politicians. The people who have been charged to watch over our best interests are the people who are profiting the most, and we're losing the most. And so at some point, we have to stop and think and breathe and see the humanity in one another. and see the importance of history. One of the things that I often share, we have a historic Overtown Legacy Trek, quick plug, the last Saturday of every month. You can do it guided with us. We would love to take you, and we literally do a walk through the community. But we talk about the power of the narrative and understanding that whoever tells your story owns your destiny, right? And even something as simple as what people know as shotgun houses. Y'all know what shotgun houses are? Yes? Okay. And so can somebody just tell us a minute, like, what do you know about a shotgun house and why is it called that?
One room behind the other. Maybe an architect should do it. Like I think the dean of architecture could better explain. I mean, basically, it's a long and narrow house where there's one door that goes into the next room, and if you stood there with a shotgun and pulled the trigger, the bullet would go straight through.
Exactly. And so that's the narrative that I've heard my whole entire life, right? The whole entire life. Listen, well, it's a narrative, right? It's a narrative. And so that's the narrative. I lived in New Orleans. I've lived in the South. You want to say? Uh-huh.
But it comes way before that. Okay. In Europe, they always used to call that the French style of designing apartments, where you always go room to room to room. There's no space for a corridor. So even before you were thinking about it, in Europe they were thinking about it, and it's been there forever, going back to the 16th century, I can tell you that.
I love that. And even before that, right, or around then, the concept was also brought, let me go over here, in West Africa. So we brought it with us throughout the Middle Passage, that concept of what was called the Shogun House, which means house of God, right? And so there's a different level of pride if you think you're living in a shotgun house as opposed to knowing that you reside in a house of God, right? And the other thing about the brilliance of our people is that not only did we bring the concept of these highly resilient homes to this space, when we got here in a foreign land, the carpenters, the master carpenters, because we always talk about the fact that we brought over slaves, but we brought over people. We brought over carpenters. We brought over mathematicians. We were brought over here. We were people first. And so the brilliance was in this foreign land, they even knew the right wood to use, the most resilient wood that would withstand everything. And it was built like that because it breathes. And the air moves in tropical climates. It easily flows through the house and it breathes in and out and in and out. But that's the power of the narrative, right? And so when we talk about affordable housing and we come from a perspective of people who are deciding for other folks what they deserve, how much they deserve, right? What we need, what is best, without leaving the people out of it, it's a challenge. And so that's my ask, is that we would always think about the people and the humanity and the power of the narrative and keeping the people, the community, center and central of that narrative and any decisions that are made.
Questions? Okay, so apparently, the QR code's gone, so it's not working. But we have a few minutes for questions. Yeah. Uh-huh.
They will allow you to create just what you said, I'll call it a French-style house. They'll allow you to put a house between the two. They're doing it all over in Los Angeles right now. So, but nobody thinks of creative zoning, as far as I'm concerned, and I've been now in Florida for about 6 years and never heard anybody talk about zoning in any proper way. Second is construction costs. There are all kinds of ways of mitigating some construction costs, but nobody wants to discuss it here in Florida. I work with a Chinese company all the time, and I can deliver to a site in Miami a furnished room at $175 a square foot, air conditioned, everything. I have not been able to get one contractor or developer to talk about it. And it does, of course, there's some other mitigating costs to that, but even so, compared to $250, $300 a square foot to build these terrible concrete things that are built all over. And the third thing is you can integrate culture, and in schools, it's a great place to talk about it. But I've never seen people really want to discuss culture when you get into a real estate conference with developers or anyone else. And I've been all over this world.
Well, I mean, what he's saying about the schools, what I called is the social services that makes also the community, like libraries, like a main street when people can sit down, have a coffee and chat, and obviously schools, and obviously small theaters or something like that. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen on these communities that have been excluded basically of everything. And I have a question to Mr. Myler. You said that you do mixed buildings because you can pay it with one, subsidize the other. As far as I know, when you are doing subsidized affordable housing, the federal government pays the difference in between what the tenant can pay and what the market value at that particular place is. So I would like to ask you if you do that too.
Yeah, so excellent question. But again, as I started, I said that, affordable housing is a very loosely used term. So for instance, we do a lot of public housing redevelopment. And on average, those units pay under $1,000, including what the tenant's paying and what the federal government HUD's paying. It's based on a chart that, historic charts that they put out, and it's part of what's called the operating subsidy that these properties receive, and then the tenant pays 30% of the rent. But there's, it's impossible to build any new unit, irrespective of using, a system that you're referring to. If you're gonna bring in a system from overseas and build that, and make your project financeable strictly with that level of income, it's impossible. Simple. There's another, thing that no matter what any developer tries to do, no matter what any government agency tries to do, the math is simply going to add up to what it adds up to, right? 2 and 2 has got to equal 4, no matter what you do. So yes, when I say that we need to have mixed income, and you need to have that same unit that is being subsidized, that might be paying $800-900 between the government subsidy and the residence portion, subsidized by someone that is paying $2,500. To add those together, it has to be like that. And in between that, you have to do workforce housing. Perfect example, the tax credit program at the state, right? It is the most lucrative form of financing to finance an affordable housing project, the 9% program, okay? The 9% program funds, on average, 3 deals in Miami-Dade County. Average size, Hannah, 120, 125 units?
On a good day.
On a good day, right? Do the math. 3 projects, 125 units apiece, 375 units on an annual basis for what you just heard Dr. Bakken talk a little bit about the stats. You will never tackle the problem building 375 units a year in Miami-Dade County. Example, we have a public housing redevelopment down the street from UM. We worked with the university as part of the process when we were applying for that. 58 public housing units. We're building 172 units in phase one. We're replacing all 58 public housing units in partnership with HUD under the RAD demonstration program, okay? All families are gonna be housed. All families are gonna get their units based on their family composition. So we have 114 of the units that are not subsidized, right? Because I'm building 172. 20% market, and the rest are affordable and workforce. You know how many respondents we had just in one outreach program, like she mentioned from the University of Miami? 600. One employer. That doesn't count the hospitals, the state attorney's office, you know, the city of South Miami, all of the other, the community. It's the need is astronomical. So yes, there's anyone that tells you that because they have a subsidized unit and that unit is going to be mathematically in the black is not, it's just not correct. The math doesn't add up.
Well, there's different kinds of subsidy. You're talking rent subsidy, then there's capital subsidy. That is, yeah,
It's absolutely correct.
yeah.
That is a fact.
So we have a question over here. You've been very patient.
All right, thank you. My name is Jalen Cole. I'm in the architecture program here. I'm also a geography and sustainable development major. And because of that particular program, I've gotten to learn a lot about the history of Miami, especially as it pertains to communities of color, and how over the years they've been consistently pushed down, pushed around, told where to live, where not to live. So I would like to know, as future designers, as future planners, what exactly do you think we can do to protect communities of color, especially from a planning standpoint? And have you seen any case studies maybe in other cities where it's actually worked? Because I personally don't feel like I've ever seen a case study where we actually protected and preserved a community of color.
You want to take this, Nicole, or?
Well, I can give you an example. I can give you a positive example. So I'm an urban historian. I was just at the Urban History Association conference in Pittsburgh, and there was a project in Pittsburgh that was a historically black community that was basically raised for urban renewal. As we know, many urban renewal projects that raised housing actually didn't rebuild housing. Oftentimes you would have like a Renaissance center or some other kind of facility, and so those residents were displaced and dispersed. It just so happens that the land that was part of this urban renewal project is now owned by the Pittsburgh Penguins, okay, a hockey team, NHL. There was also an AME church that was displaced as a result of this urban renewal project. So colleagues of mine have done online mapping projects like some of what you've seen on my slides up here. We do a lot of online mapping to get data around housing affordability, the way that climate change is going to impact housing, et cetera. They've done a project called Mapping Inequality, which basically looks at the whole history of redlining in cities all across the country. And now they've updated that to do a project called Mapping Renewal. So as a result of this project, they looked at historic census data for this urban renewal neighborhood in Pittsburgh. They found all the people who were living there, the addresses, what those people did, tried to track where they moved. And through an effort around reparations as a result of displacement and wealth disinvestment as a result of urban renewal, they entered into a deal, the church and some of those family members of those residents with the Pittsburgh Penguins, where the Pittsburgh Penguins helped finance completely new affordable housing. It's actually mixed income housing, again, because of the market, and a new AME church just adjacent to this property, right? So again, when you think about what's possible, it is possible to do this kind of work. It takes commitment and persistence, like Nicole talked about. It takes having the right kind of policy framework, right? So we've talked about the fact that in the state of Florida, it's very difficult for us to implement policies like rent control, vacancy tax, anything else that gets involved in the private operation of the real estate market. But it's not necessarily the case in other places, right? Other places have cooperative housing, rent control, vacancy taxes, the end of single-family zoning, right? This is a big issue in Miami-Dade County. 80% of our residentially zoned property, I don't know why this is giving feedback, but is zoned single-family, right? So there are a whole host of policy solutions as well, and that's just a matter of political will. Right? The political will to make policy change.
And I thought, I did want to add to that. And there are certain things that have been put in place. For example, in Overtown, there was a community oversight board. And for lack of a better word, it was undermined, right? Because the oversight board was supposed to have a say in whatever development came in, right? And to say yay or nay, right? And so to say it was undermined is a gross understatement, but it's the most polite thing that I can say in this moment, because it was early on, I think it was functional, but as time has gone on, there's no way to really push against the political will, right? And so in the process, not only was it disbanded, but now all of these buildings are going up everywhere. And to the point of, I'm grateful that they're rebuilding the AME church, right? And there has to be something in place to stop the bleeding, because in the process, all of these historic places are being knocked down. Like every week in Overtown, and Overtown is but so big, right? But every week in Overtown, a different historic building is being knocked down because it's not significant to whoever makes the decisions, right? So it's like, what's important and who decides?
We have other questions? Okay.
Hi. I'm Michaela. I'm also a student in the architecture program. So I have two questions. One is pertaining to the Live Local housing program. And just kind of, I would like an explanation more of that, and also maybe an explanation of why it might not work as much as it might have intended to. And then my other question pertains to Section 8 housing, and that being basically torn down once like the time is up. So I'm questioning, are there certain like laws or coding and stuff that doesn't allow for that to be, excuse me, put in place forever? Like, is there a certain time limit?
Which one do you want to take, Al? You want to do Live Local?
You can do Live Local. I'll do the next one.
All right. So Live Local Act, and I'm assuming you're talking about the zoning, because there was a bunch of stuff in the Live Local Act. The Live Local Act, and I'm going to paraphrase, and I'm not going to get this exactly right, but is basically allowing for affordable housing to be built in, help me out here, do you remember this?
Area zone, commercial or industrial.
Good, industrial, thank you. And to take the zoning, Al, you were really going to help me out, because I'm just like blanking on
yeah,
this.
so the idea behind Live Local is that to allow projects that have at least 40% affordable housing to get built in commercially zoned or industrially zoned areas without going through the public hearing process. So they have, some of the things you might have read about in the paper in certain municipalities that they're contesting, well, they're gonna bring this big building in here. The idea was that you can go and build without going through a full public hearing process, because unfortunately, what's happening, and we were talking about this earlier, right? Before we started the conferences, there's a lot of NIMBYism, and that's just like, everybody understands the need for affordable housing. Most people will say yes, they'll come into a conference like this and they'll say it's great and we like this, and everybody, gets a warm and fuzzy feeling, and as soon as they walk out that door and they go to where their neighborhood is, whatever that is, and that project comes in front of that zoning board, then they don't have such a warm and fuzzy feeling, right? And so that's what happens. So in a nutshell, and Hannah's correct, there's a lot of components in Live Local. There's tax incentives. The state of Florida put a 10-year commitment, $150 million a year for 10 years. That's $1.5 billion commitment. That's unheard of for the state of Florida. They fully funded the Sadowski Trust Fund. That's unheard of for the state of Florida. So there's a lot of good stuff in the Live Local Act, but the one that's getting the most press is that. How do you build these buildings quickly? And it's because there's many communities that are just, they can't attack the project because you might meet your zoning criteria, but they're going to attack it in a different way, and they're too much density, too much this, and eventually the developer gives up and they won't build the project.
We call it slow walking.
Right.
They can slowly walk everything through the building department, through the zoning department. We call it slow walking.
Very slow walking.
Very slow walking. Yeah. If you don't have the support. So that is the issue. On the Section 8, I will tell you, yes, we do have expiring contracts in the Section 8 program, and we have seen those properties go to market. HUD does have a lot of protections in place for those properties, and they are now allowing us to redevelop, because some of these Section 8 contracts are on really awful, terribly built, old buildings. So we've got programs in place where we can actually take those contracts, we can either move them to a property very nearby, or we can actually redevelop that site. So we certainly hear about these expiring properties, but I'm not hearing so much that we're losing the Section 8, and maybe you're hearing more, but I'm not hearing that so much as we're actually being able to redevelop these sites now.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one thing really quickly. So my office is working with Miami-Dade County's Department of Public Housing, and we've created a housing affordability tracker. So we're literally tracking every unit that is in any way affordable being developed in Miami-Dade County. So right now, in the pipeline between 2020 and today, there are 28,000 units in the pipeline. So there is work being done. I don't want us to come away from this session feeling like it's hopeless and there's nothing being done. There is work being done within the parameters that it can be, given our local legislative, statewide legislative framework, the realities of inflation and the housing market today, but there is work being done.
And to say that, I think between Al and I and the projects that we're working on, we're probably in the thousands of units. Now, some of my projects are preservation projects, right? So I'm making sure we're going in and rehabbing, we're extending the land use restrictions to make sure they stay affordable. Some of them are new construction, but I really think between the two of us and our projects, we're in the thousands right now of units in Miami-Dade County.
Can I just ask a quick question in terms of that? And then what is the quality of the units that are coming online? Because I've heard horror stories. I've seen horror stories.
That is so interesting. So obviously projects have to meet all the building codes, right? So I don't know what projects you're talking about. Maybe folks are being cheaper in the finishes, but we've got impact windows, we've got energy efficiency standards, we have to meet the 160 mile per hour standards of the construction. So I'd be interested, Nicole, actually, when we're done to hear about that. Okay, 2 more questions.
So we've clearly extended the Q&A session because there's so much interest around this topic. I'm going to have 2 more questions, and then our generous speakers, panelists, are going to stay behind and answer all the other questions that you may have on a one-to-one basis. And we've asked our crew in the back to stay a little longer so that we make sure you have refreshments for a little bit longer than we had planned. So the first of the 2 questions.
Thanks, crew, for staying after. So I've started up a little YIMBY organization in Miami, and we're specifically trying to go after this question of the zoning code and of the land use code, because we can't control inflation, we can't control supply chains, we can't control people who want to move to Miami, but we can control with our political choices the context of what gets built. And so I guess my question is mainly for Albert, about how, when you're developing something, how does that intersect with either Live Local, which gives you some options to bypass this, or we were working before Live Local on the RTZ, the Rapid Transit Zone ordinances at the county level. For example, when I saw the recent movie about Liberty Square, I don't know, the new units, they look pretty good. I thought they were nice. I thought they were an obvious improvement over the status quo, but it's like I saw the footprint of the land, and so much of the land had been taken up by the setbacks from the street, by the mandatory parking coverage over what used to be green spaces between the buildings, and limited height restrictions, double-loaded stairwell corridors. Like, how do you guys navigate all these building codes?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent point, because at the end of the day, there's only one way to address the shortage, and that's through increasing supply. There is no other mechanism in order to tackle this problem, because you're going to continue to have, an influx of people wanting to live in Miami-Dade County. That's going to continue to create pressures on all of the income brackets. So you need to increase supply. Now, case in point, you brought up Liberty Square. That project was zone T4R, all 50 acres, 9 city blocks, T4R. Which in the city of Miami is 36 units an acre with a 3-story maximum. So we had to work with the, in this case, this is a county project, but it's in the city of Miami. So we had to do cross-jurisdictional zoning approvals. We had to work with the city of Miami to create a zoning district that allowed us to incorporate a lot of the uses that were part of our community engagement process, our community benefits agreement, because T4R is strictly residential. The R is restricted. And so that was, to Nicole's point, I mean, it was restricted for a reason, okay? So though our plan called for, education, healthcare, a lot of other uses that the community requested, we weren't allowed to build that without going through the rezoning process. So now 5 of the blocks are T50. So now we can go 5 stories or up to 8 stories with certain affordable housing. And our next phases are 5 stories, the current phase that's under construction. And now we're building a health facility, and now we're building the new home for the Miami-Dade Chamber that's going to be housed there at Liberty Square. But we couldn't do that before with the previous zoning. So zoning is a big impediment. But in many instances, you mentioned RTZ. We just broke ground on a project in Little Havana last week. That project was also in the city of Miami. We had to work with the county because it was a county-owned project, and working with HUD. And we had to get the county to take over the jurisdiction of the zoning of that property, change it to RTZ, and again, it was a T4 also, and we went from 36 units to 172 units. So that is the impact of zoning, and in many cases, zoning is the impediment. And then back to your question of Live Local, if they can't get you because on the text of the zoning is, a certain way, and you might be able to, position your project a certain way, then they slow walk you, right? So the idea of Live Local is that, to expand the enhancements of zoning without having to go through the whole arduous process. Because now if you're within a mile, you can go to the highest density within the city. So that's some of the benefits within Live Local itself.
But I do want to add, I'm building in an urban center district right now, right? So it's around transit, it's all the stuff that you want. But in that urban transit district, getting to this cost, I have 9-foot sidewalks. I have an arcade that is coming over my sidewalk. I have a road that is dictated that I had to build on my property because I couldn't build on that property unless I put a road in there. So when we get to sort of the cost of affordable housing, it's not just that unit, right? I had to bring sewer because there's no sewer. The sewer is going 6 blocks because I'm in this emerging urban transit area, right? So all of those things add to the costs of our development. You know, yes, I think it's good, but we need to be also realistic about the impact of those kinds of requirements. The glazing requirements. Impact glass is incredibly expensive. And the glazing, the proportion of windows that I have to have, right, compared to the building, it's very expensive.
Hello, my name is Takara Ware, and I think it's imperative that we differentiate the difference between workforce housing and affordable housing because it can be detrimental to like cross the two. So I would like for people to understand, if Milo can explain to us, what is your requirements for affordable housing versus workforce housing? Because the apartments that are built down the street actually grew up in that community, and I'm a part of the community board for those houses, and there are a lot of families being displaced in that area. I know that the projects, what so many people would call them, they will be rehoused, but there are people who don't make 2.7 of the rent a month to move back to the community. So my question really is, how do we not blur the lines between workforce housing and affordable housing, because it's two completely different things?
Yeah, so workforce housing, generally speaking, and based on the definition even now of Live Local and Florida Housing for a while, and Miami-Dade County, is typically going to be families or residents that earn between 80% of area median income up to 120% of median income, generally. Miami-Dade County has a little bit broader range, and they'll go in some of their programs up to 140% of area median income, but it's generally between 80 and 120. And right now, a single family, one-person household, 80% is right around 57,000, and 120% is right around 87,000. So that's kind of the spectrum for a single person household. Affordable housing is typically 80% and below. And most tax credit units are 60% of area median income and below. Right now, because after 2017, based on the tax reform that was passed, there's a program called income averaging, and you're able to now get tax credits on units that go up to 80% as long as your average rents are 60%. It's highly technical, but in some of the projects that we do and the one that you're referring to, because we have these HUD units that we're doing, those are at a lower AMI, it allows us to average our units with those 80% units and have more what's called low-income housing tax credit units. So we have more of an income diversity in that project. But typically, affordable stops at 80 and workforce starts at 80 to 120.
But having said that, I hate that definition, right? I do, because folks who are making less than 80 in this county are working, right? So I really hate that we sort of put that line there of what's workforce and what's affordable, right? I live in affordable housing. I live in affordable housing. It's not subsidized, but it's affordable to me, right? So.
All right, so I'm going to wrap this wonderful session up. My thanks to Dr. Charles Bull for starting us off, to our fabulous moderator, Hannah Eskra, and to our panelists, Dr. Robin Bakken, Mr. Albert Milo, and Nicole Crooks. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing with us not only your expertise, but how you are very thoughtful in the ways that you all are thinking about these issues and allowing us to understand the complexities around these topics. For those of you that are in the audience, you may have heard the word zoning come up quite a few times during this session, and you'll be happy to know that next week's salon focuses on the design of cities, and it's entitled, How Do We Reframe the Design of Cities to Support Sustainable, and to Nicole's point, culturally connected housing alternatives. Again, we will have a group of panelists that are each experts in their own areas, and we really would appreciate seeing you all again for next week's session. In the meantime, we want to ask you to stay behind, have a chat, get to know some of our panelists. They are very generous with their time, and they're willing to stay behind and talk to you in more detail. I would be remiss if I did not thank Madeline Lee and Gloria Shanahan for their collaboration, and of course, our school's leader, Dean Rodolphe El-Khoury, for allowing us to have these sessions and to come together to have these conversations so that we can not only sort of learn more, but also figure out how we become parts of solutions rather than just parts of problems, okay? So thank you again for coming and being with us this evening. Hope to see you next week.